And this morning we're going to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We are returning to our study in 1 Timothy, God's blueprint for a healthy church. And as we turn to the text today, I'd like to open up with a question that I think is just it's just out in the world around us. And it's not like it's only new this year or last year. It's been around for a while, but let's just ask the question, is the local church still relevant to the world in which we live? Is the local church still relevant to the world in which we live? I mean, we look around. It doesn't matter whether we're looking in America, we're looking over at Europe. Attendance is in steep decline, especially among millennials and Gen Z. I was reading on this week, and to quote a young woman from an NP article written in 2022, they was talking about kind of this whole change in church, just kind of meeting as a garden club was their church. She said to this, generally I want two things out of church. One, I want to sit down like we do on Sundays sometimes around the garden fire pit and pray and recenter and figure what we're about in this world. Because the world is very noisy. And number two, I want a church that gets stuff done with our community and for our community. I want a place to unwind. I want to do stuff in the world. But this trend isn't confined. This concern and wonder about the church isn't confined to younger generations. A 2020 study by the Barna Group revealed that 50% of American Christians believe that church as usual, now that would be interesting to define, church as usual is declining in popularity. But it begs the question, why is the case? Why is this the case? Well, as I was studying this week and as we've been going through 1 Timothy, I think one of the reasons is because modern Christians have lost sight of the church's uniqueness. That the church has a unique place in the plan of God. And the churches are pursuing all sorts of relevance in the community, but forgetting the reason for which it's been created. See, we need to be clear, efforts to care for the needy, to provide a place of community for God's people, and to help people live moral lives are important aspects of what it means to follow Jesus Christ. We need to. But these services are not the source of our relevance in the world. See, as we're going to see in the text today, Paul is going to tell us the local church is the centerpiece of God's saving purpose in the world. The church is the centerpiece of God's saving purpose in the world. And that's because, number one, the church is the home of God's people. We're going to see that in verses 14 and 15. And the other thing we're going to see in the text today is that the church is both the guardian and the herald of God's truth. We see that in the second half of verse 15 and verse 16 today. So let's go to our text. It's only 3 verses. I hope to come to you soon, Paul says. Writing to Timothy, who's ministering in the city of Ephesus. But I'm writing these things to you, that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and a buttress of the truth. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifest in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on the world, and taken up in glory. You know, the first thing that we see in these verses is that Paul is being really helpful to those of us who are really slow on the uptake. You ever just kind of like feel like you're kind of slow to pick up what somebody else is laying down? Like what's the point? Sometimes when we're reading through an epistle or a letter written to a church, sometimes we're also asking, all right, what's the main point of the whole letter? Well, he tells us right here. The reason I've written you this letter. He tells us. And he tells them what it's about. He said, I want you to know how you are to behave in the household of God. That's what he's concerned with. How are you supposed to behave in the household of God? But let's think about it. What kind of behavior does Paul have in mind? Well, all we got to do is look back at the preceding 3 chapters. What kind of behavior has Paul been talking about? Chapter 1. The first thing that Paul's coming right out of the gate in the book, he's like, you need to protect sound doctrine. Protect it. Protect it at all costs, because foolish speculations and ignorant abuses of God's law lead to shipwreck of people's faith. It's important. Number 2, in regards to the behavior, they need to purify worship within the church. And that specifically meant that men needed to be lifting up their holy hands in prayer instead of quarreling with one another. Women needed to focus on worship instead of their appearance. And the church as a whole needed to abide by God's design for leadership and teaching in the local church. From the foundation of the world, before man fell into sin, God has established roles for men and women in the church. And then we get to chapter 3. They need to select qualified leaders in the church. The church is going to do what it's called to do in the world. It needs to have the right leaders. Select qualified elders to lead and to teach. Select qualified deacons to serve so the church can rightly fulfill its mission in the world. See, what I want you to see in this is that while every single Christian is called to live a life of obedience before the Lord, like that's without question. The first 3 chapters of this book are not focused on a Christian's private behavior. It's not focused on our private behavior. No, they're focused on a Christian's behavior within the context of ministry and worship and fellowship in the local church. How we're behaving when we gather together. That's his focus. But why is Paul so focused on this kind of behavior? Why is it so specific? Why is it so important? Well, as we look at the text, we're going to see 3 reasons. 2 this week, 1 next week. Number 1, it's the home of God's people, as we've already identified. Number 2, it's called to herald God's truth. And next week, we're going to see the church is constantly under spiritual attack. There's constant threats. So we need to be aware. But let's come to another question that comes out of the text, because there's a couple things in here it'd be easy for us to move past. It's so easy for us to key in on things like behavior and overlook the context in which that behavior is happening, which Paul calls the household of God. Because that's where he's focused. Like behavior in the household of God. So what does he mean by household of God? Well, if we just trace that Greek word household, just in chapter 3 where we've been working already, it's pretty clear that Paul is using this word household as a metaphor for family. Family. We look back at the qualification of elders. An elder must manage his household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. If someone doesn't know how to manage his household, if he doesn't know how to manage his family, how will he care for God's church? We get to deacons in verse 12. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. So he's talking about the church as a family, but here's the key. When we think about being part of this family that Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy chapter 3, we don't simply become part of God's family because our parents are Christians. We don't simply become part of God's family because we attend the same church, or we try to follow the moral teachings of Jesus, or we think Jesus was a pretty nice guy who had most things right. That's not how we become part of this household. No, we become part of this family by trusting in God's Son, Jesus Christ, for our only hope of salvation. That's how we become part of the family, and we're forever adopted into God's family. I mean, just the basic essence of the gospel, verses we should all have known from childhood. I mean, we all got John 3:16. It's at every football game, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace you've been saved through faith. It's not our own doing. It's the gift of God, not by works, lest any man should boast. Like this is how we become part of this family. Not any other way. But now let's kind of think about applying this a little bit. When Paul calls the church the household of God, or if we want to call it the family of God, he's telling us that the church is not supposed to be like a concert venue. The church is not supposed to be like a movie theater. It's not supposed to be like a lecture hall that we attend for our own personal edification as individuals. We walk in the door as individuals or as individual families, like we did this last week. We went to see Mission Impossible. We walked into the movie theater with our tickets. We found our seats. We sat down. We watched a movie by ourselves. When it was over, we got up as a family. We left and we got in our car. We didn't hang around and talk with everybody. We didn't go in the lobby and hang around for an hour and a half like what happens here on Sunday morning. No, we got in the car and we went home. See, that's not supposed to be what the church is like. Just a place to come in and a place to leave. And then on the other hand, it's not merely supposed to be a community service center, even though God cares about how we interact with our community. No, he's actually telling us when he calls the church family, when he refers to the church as the household of God, he's saying no matter what you've done, no matter what's been done to you in this life, no matter how good or how bad your home life was growing up, how bad your family is right now, it doesn't matter if you've been abandoned by your family. You got kids that have walked away from the Lord, and they've walked away from you as well. If you're a true believer in Jesus, the church is your home. It's what it's supposed to be like. It's your family. And because of that, you and I have been saved into an eternal relationship with one another. And just like family, we don't get to pick and choose our brothers and sisters. As a church, we don't really get to pick and choose each other. We're saved into eternal relationship with one another. And while we're still living on this earth and we're still struggling to overcome our indwelling sin, our relationships inside the church are going to be challenged. They are going to be threatened. We're sinners saved by grace. We are not perfect yet. There might even be times we wish we belonged to a different family. But it's the very reason I think that Paul's writing this here. He's trying to realign the affections of the Ephesian church. He's realigning their affections so they can find a greater delight both in God and in one another. Because he knows that an ever-growing delight in God will necessarily overflow into a growing delight and joy in one another. Let's make sure we get that orientation right. As we grow in our joy and our delight and our satisfaction for God, as we find greater joy in that relationship, it overflows horizontally into our life. But it doesn't work the other way around. We can't find the kind of joy and unity in a church just by simply looking at each other. I mean, have you looked at each other? I mean, if you just simply look at the other people in church, you have greater reasons not to find unity, not to feel like a family. I like what A.W. Tozer points out in his book, The Pursuit of God, on this point. He gives this illustration. He says, has it ever occurred to you that 100 pianos all tuned to the same fork are automatically tuned to one another? Okay, does everybody get the picture? 100 pianos, they all need to be tuned. They get tuned to one fork. Nowadays, it's probably some electronic device. I don't think they use a fork anymore. But anyway, all tuned to the same fork. They're automatically in tune to each other. He goes on to say they're of one accord by being tuned, not to each other, but to the standard to which each individual must bow. So 100 worshipers meeting together, each looking away from themselves to Christ, are in heart nearer to one another than they could possibly be if they were to become all of a sudden unity conscious and turn their eyes away from God and strive for closer fellowship by looking at one another. That's worth something to think about. We don't gain our sense of family by merely looking at each other, but by looking to God. See, when Paul calls the church the household of God, he's not talking about a building. He's not talking about some kind of special sacred space that demands solemn decorum that exists. There's this secret special place that we all go and we find God. It's not like the Old Testament with the temple or the tabernacle. He's emphasizing the familial nature of the church and the unifying headship of God, our Father. He's saying, how is the family unified? It's unified in its Father. Because he's the one who's delivered us from the kingdom of darkness. He's the one who's brought us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. He's the one who knows our every need before we ask him in prayer. He's the one who's working all things together for his children's good so that they might be conformed to the likeness of his Son, Jesus, and receive everlasting joy. This is what it means to belong to the household of God. But as we keep reading, Paul transitions to another relational metaphor. He calls us the church of the living God. With household of God, we're at the church of the living God. And it'd be really easy for us to just kind of skip over this second metaphor because it sounds so familiar. But in linking the household of God to the church of the living God, Paul's actually kind of expanding and deepening this original picture of family, because God doesn't just adopt us into his family. You know, if we want to kind of just stay on that picture of adoption that we're given in the New Testament, God doesn't adopt us and send us off to boarding school. God doesn't adopt us and have this big building with all of his kids, but he lives in another place. No, we are the church of the living God. He lives within our midst. And I know this might not seem like much of a distinction for some of you, because your father was always part of your home. Some people grew up in really solid families with a great central fatherly figure. But those of you who grew up with fathers in the military who are always gone, or another job that constantly took them away, some of you grew up in families that were broken. Some of you grew up with really bad fathers. Paul's helping us see that God is present. He is with us. He's reminding that God is always present with his family. We don't have to hope on a Sunday morning that God is going to show up. We don't have to wonder if God is with us. And I'm not talking merely in the sense of God being omnipresent. This is not the category of mere omnipresence. This is in relational presence. God lives with his people. And this is important because it's so easy for us as modern Christians to define the church as a place or an event that occurs instead of the people. We trace the word church to the New Testament. We see it's always a people. Ecclesia, assembly, the called out ones. It's always a reference to people. And as we look at kind of how New Testament authors describe the church, the people of the living God, New Testament authors actually describe it in terms that belong with the tabernacle and the temple in the Old Testament. I'll just grab one text for the moment. Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. So you think of the Old Testament, you think of, we got the children of Israel, they're out in the desert, tabernacle gets carried, gets set up, God comes and resides at the tabernacle, right? We have the temple built by Solomon. God comes and fills the temple. God is present in his temple. Ephesians 2, starting in verse 19. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. So this is Jews and Gentile, both part of God's family. And how is this household built? It's built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into what? It grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. God is with us. God is present with his family. See, in the single phrase, the church of the living God, Paul is reminding Timothy, and he's reminding his church in Ephesus, that God does not dwell in temples built by human hands. He doesn't dwell in grandiose structures, whether they be cathedrals or simple buildings like ours, merely because they're buildings. No, he lives among his people, especially as they gather for corporate worship. God is in our midst right now. I mean, if you think about it, like why do we even organize our service the way that we do? Why do we begin with a call to worship? Why do we end with a benediction? We're saying right now, as we're gathering together, there's something we want to make clear. God is here. Call to worship, come. We are worshiping God. We are not here to please ourselves. We are not here to watch a concert happen on stage. We're here to worship. Why does it end with a benediction? There's a closing saying we're now transitioning to a time where we're going to be moving back out into the world. This time that we have together, it's about God. Why are we so careful about what we choose in music, songs we do and don't use? We want it to be focused on our God, not just on what's pleasing to ourselves. And I can speak as a guitarist when things that are just fun to play. It's also why the weekly gathering of God's people is so important. The writer of Hebrews pleads with his people. Hebrews 10, starting in verse 24. He says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and what good works. He's thinking about the church, the local church, the body of Christ. What do we be doing with each other? Getting in conflict, getting frustrated? No, we're supposed to be loving each other, building each other up in love and good works. And how does that happen? It happens when we're together, because what's the flip side? Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Super short application at this point. In our day and age, this means TV church and online church are not an acceptable substitute for worship in the local church. Now, when you're sick, it's great to be able to check in and see what was going on at church and be a part of it. It has a place, but it is never there to replace the gathering of God's people. Those who've been saved by God's grace and indwelt by his living Spirit need the real thing. We need it. We need to regularly assemble with fellow believers. Because Sunday worship and Wednesday night discipleship and community groups, every time we gather, we are gathering as the assembly, as the family of the living God. Not merely a group of individuals. So this is just a small picture of what it means. What's really packed into being the household of God, the church of the living God. But that's who we are. That's our identity. What does Paul do next? He actually moves from our identity to our purpose and our calling in the world. In verses 15 and 16. I'll pick it up at the beginning. If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifest in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. So as we come to this, we need to ask a question to begin with. What in the world does Paul mean when he calls the church, when he calls the family of God, the pillar and buttress of the truth? I mean, it's clear he's using architectural metaphors here. I think we get that much. You know, if you think about pillars, and I think pillars are pretty plain, like pillars stand up on the foundation. Pillars are there to hold up roofs. They're there to hold up the second story of a building. Like they're there to hold up something. But how about this word buttress? Like this one's a little more difficult, and it's difficult for at least two reasons. I mean, number one, the obvious one is this is a super rare word in the Greek, and translators kind of struggle with nailing down its exact meaning. And also number two, when we hear the word buttress, if you've been around, you probably think, oh, this is like the flying buttresses of medieval design. Those didn't exist yet. Those big, long structures that they used to hold up those walls of the churches. It's like, okay, those didn't exist yet. So it's like how are we a buttress to the truth? Well, if we look at how other translations have rendered the word, and maybe you're looking at your Bible going, Mark, my Bible doesn't say buttress anyway. If you're reading your NASB, it says support. If you're reading your NIV, it says foundation. I think we're getting a lot closer into maybe being a more helpful understanding of this word. It's a support of the truth. As John Stott puts it in his commentary on 1 Timothy, he says, first, as a support, Paul is calling the church to hold the truth. Remember what? The church is a pillar and foundation of the truth. The church is to hold the truth. And they're to hold the truth so it doesn't collapse under the weight of false teaching. That's what was going on in chapter 1. It's also what he's going to warn us about as we get into chapter 4. It doesn't collapse. But secondly, as a pillar of the truth, he's calling the church to hold the truth high. To keep the truth out there so it's not hidden from the world. To get it elevated and to keep it out. So the church has this twofold calling and its reason to be in the world, to be protecting the truth and to be holding it high and proclaiming the truth. And what's the truth that we've been given? We see it in verse 16. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. Speaking of Jesus, he was manifest in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. Now, if you've been with us through this whole study, you might be keen on a word that Paul uses here that might seem out of place. He uses the word mystery. And mystery seems a little bit out of place because Paul in chapter 1 confronted a group of unfaithful teachers who were devoted to myths and endless genealogies and speculations. And mystery sure sounds like myth and speculation. Like if he's against all the speculation, why is he talking about mystery? Well, as we read through our New Testament, we see this word mystery used time and time again. It's consistently used to denote something that was hidden, but now has been revealed by God himself. It was hidden. It's now revealed. Specifically, God's long hidden plan of redemption, which is no longer secret, but is now revealed. Looking backwards in our Old Testament, we understand texts in ways that original audiences didn't understand them, because through Jesus Christ and his coming, they're now clear. And it's all about redemption. And what is this mystery? This mystery is that the incarnation, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus Christ reveals something that mankind does not know on their own. They need to know that they are not in a place where they can stand before the Lord. They are in need in a provision of godliness, and God has provided it in Jesus Christ. I mean, if you think about it, you're reading through the Old Testament. Psalm 18. First half talking about general revelation, everything that we can see and discern about God. We see his work in the heavens. We see his handiwork. We can tell that there's a God that's there. But one thing that creation will never tell us in and of itself. Look at the Grand Canyon. Go up to Hurricane Ridge. Go out to the Washington coast. Go anywhere. One thing creation cannot tell you is that you are separated from God. You are under his wrath, and you need to be restored. Creation can't tell you that. But Jesus Christ revealed it. That's the mystery that's been revealed. As we already saw this morning, as we were in communion, Romans chapter 3, no one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God, all have turned aside, together they become worthless. No one does good, not even one. We get to Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's the surprising mystery of the gospel. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. To be honest, as we look at this final verse, we could spend the entire morning unpacking the riches that are packed into this ancient confession, which is really, like, scholars think it's like a confession or a creed or maybe an early hymn. In the original Greek, there's a beautiful rhyming structure in it. It was written to be memorized, it was written to be spoken, and it was written to be remembered. So what I'd like to do this morning is I highlight its key movements. To understand what are the most important things that the early church wanted to emphasize about this truth. What are the most important things that they wanted to get their hands around? And remember, early church, this letter is written probably around 55 AD. We're talking not very long after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is not centuries. This is a decade plus. So let's walk through it. What is this mystery of godliness? Jesus was manifest in the flesh. Just think about manifest in the flesh. What are they doing right out of the gate in this declaration about Jesus Christ? Is affirming the incarnation of Jesus Christ. And in affirming the incarnation, what are we affirming? It's reminding us that our need as human beings is so great that the eternal Son of God, the architect and the upholder and the judge of the universe, the one who is without beginning, the one who is without end, had to take on our flesh and blood. He had to die for our sin so that we could be restored to God. He had to take it on. He had to become like us to redeem us. He was vindicated by the Spirit, quickly moving from his incarnation and his death to his resurrection, reminding us that what's going on in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, it's vindication. It's this big, gigantic, not guilty stamp on the death of Jesus Christ. All of the accusations that were raised against him. Blasphemy, declaring himself to be God. He's a fake king. Not guilty. Everything he said is true. God reversed his death and brought him back to life to prove everything he said was true. Seen by angels, focusing on the fact that the resurrection wasn't only seen by human witnesses, which is necessary, but it's witnessed by the angels as well. Yet as we continue reading, it's interesting that this early Christian hymn doesn't end with the account of the resurrection. It doesn't end with the account of angelic witnesses. It actually transitions to the fact that this proclamation of the incarnation, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ was already being proclaimed throughout the entire world. Again, remember, this is an early letter. It's being proclaimed. Not only is it being proclaimed, but countless people from every tribe, tongue, and nation are responding to the gospel in faith. There's a lot jammed into this tiny little hymn. People are responding to the gospel, and this is important because it doesn't just point back to what they've believed, which is when we think of creeds, confessions, we often think about what are they affirming, what have we believed, but it's actually reminding us that the gospel is active and it's working and people are coming to faith. It's doing what God designed it to do. And it reminds them of their calling to be actively sharing the gospel. It's reminding these church members as they recite or they sing this confession that there's a task that belongs to them. Not just protecting the truth, but declaring it and heralding it and sharing it with all those who need to hear. And then it ends with a line that seems kind of out of place. At least if we're thinking in terms of historical development. And I think for Americans, we're very linear most of the time. Going, how comes that's out of place? Why does it end with taken up in glory after we get to Jesus being proclaimed to the nations? Because Jesus was taken up in glory after he was raised from the dead, right? Well, as scholars have wrestled with this, I think a really good answer as I was reading is if we read this line in light of the spread of the gospel that's just declared in this creed. It seems like this final line is actually an exclamation of comfort and hope. What did the early church need to know if they were going to hold on to the truth and if they were going to herald it to the nations? What did they need to know? They needed to know that they weren't playing religious games. They needed to know that it was really worth it. They needed to know that the church is the centerpiece of God's saving purpose in the world and that Jesus is reigning over all things and in glory. Therefore, what better way to conclude the hymn than by celebrating the glorious truth that Jesus is reigning at the right hand of the Father? Everything they're doing is because of what Jesus has done, where he is right now. And though it's not stated in the hymn, the promise that he's coming back. Every incentive to do what Paul is calling them to do. Hold the truth. Herald the truth. Who's responsible for holding the truth and heralding the truth? Is it seminary professors at schools around the nations? Is it other special individuals? Actually, not according to this text. The local church. The local church is responsible for holding it. The local church is responsible for heralding it. It's a duty that belongs to us. So as I conclude this morning, I'd like to close with two implications for the church today. We could probably draw a number out, but let's grab two. Number one, what happens when a church fails to guard the truth? And when I say church here, I'm talking about local church. What happens when a local church fails to guard the truth? Like what happens if an entire church, like Timothy's church in Ephesus, like we'll use that so we don't look around at other places and start to lay blame. What happens if that church decides to abandon the gospel so they can focus on other things? Maybe there's some more important things, some community outreach, some other things we ought to do. Maybe we need, maybe we need to kind of lay off on this gospel stuff because it's creating division in our community. Maybe we ought to spend some more time just hanging out with people and learning out where they're at in life. Well, what happens if they abandon the gospel to do that? If the gospel is not the heart of their interaction with the community? Does the truth cease to be the truth? The truth doesn't cease to be the truth. God's offer of forgiveness in the gospel does not become null and void if a church abandons the truth and starts to do things that have nothing to do with the gospel. What ceases to be when a church walks away from the truth is the knowledge of the truth. Let that sink in. When a local church abandons the truth, what is lost is the knowledge of the truth and any true lasting impact that church could ever have on the community. They might feed thousands of people, but condemn them to everlasting punishment because they don't share the gospel. They might create basketball courts and build houses, give people better lives in this world, condemn them to everlasting judgment. What's lost is the knowledge of the truth and any lasting impact that a church can truly have. See, when a church abandons the truth and pivots to other activities, it may call itself a church. Church may be out on the sign out front, but it has lost its God-given purpose in the world. It's no longer truly a church. That's what happens when the church abandons the truth. Second and final question. How might the modern church respond to this growing charge of irrelevance? How do we respond to it? Number one, I think that, and this is harder for those who are older, I'm pretty sure. I mean, now I'm fitting that category of older, not old, but older, now that I'm 55. We live in a post-Christian world. This is not the world that I grew up in the 70s. We live in a post-Christian world. The church is no longer seen as a positive influence in the community. In many cases, Christians are viewed as self-righteous hate mongers. And in large part, this is due to the fact that again, just to kind of use broad generational terms, it's because millennials and Gen Z, many of them have grown up in a purely secular and increasingly progressive world. They've grown up in a world where they've never really been instructed in God's word. They can't tell you who Cain and Abel is. They can't tell you the difference between Noah and Abraham. They can't tell you the difference between the Ark of the Covenant and Noah's Ark, unless they watched Indiana Jones. But what this means, it means that their worldview is very skeptical. Some of them outright antagonistic to the basic message of the gospel because of how they have been trained and what they have learned in the schools in which they have grown up in. Whether that be the public schools they were in, or maybe off later on when they went to school, college. They're antagonistic or skeptical because, as I already said, number one, they've never been exposed really to God's word, the message in it. They've never really truly been exposed to the clear message of the gospel. In addition to this, they've been taught that truth is relative. Why is it so hard to interact? If truth is relative, how can you talk about this truth of the gospel? If everyone is free to find their own personal truth, that's the world in which we live. And my personal truth doesn't have to agree with your personal truth. We just have to let them both exist. But I think the hardest part is that many in these generations, not all, they've been taught that it's really an act of hatred, maybe all-out violence, to disagree with an individual's sense of truth or their sense of identity. It's like one of the highest sins in our culture. And that's just number one. Two others really quickly. We need to recognize not only that we are no longer that we now live in a post-Christian world, we need to recognize, Christian, hear this, there is nothing wrong with the gospel. There's nothing wrong with the gospel. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It still does what God has designed it to do. It is still the only way for salvation. There is no other way. Apart from it, all people, doesn't matter who they are, what they're doing, what their particular sin issue is, they are destined for hell because there's only one gospel. There's one truth that saves. And therefore, we need to resist the constant temptation to water down or to twist the truth to make it more acceptable in the culture in which we live. If we're going to be ostracized, let it be for telling the clear truth, but telling it in love because we care. Finally, number three. Third thing we need to recognize. The early church didn't have it easy either. The early church did not have an easy time sharing the gospel. They were hated, they're abused, they're persecuted on every side. Like we live in a post-Christian world, they lived in a pre-Christian world, they lived in a pagan world. Yet through it all, what do we see in the early church? They remained faithful to the gospel. They guarded the truth of the gospel. They shared the message of the gospel. And one by one, through their diligence and through their faithfulness, God-hating idol worshipers came to faith in Jesus Christ. The lost became found because somebody cared enough to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is our job as a church. We may struggle to do many things well as a church, but if we fail at this, we fail at our reason for existing. Let's close in a word of prayer.